All right, so today we're diving into a world that might surprise some folks. The world of political machines in American cities right around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Now, when you hear political machines, it doesn't exactly, make you think about good, clean fun, right?
Really?
We think corruption, we think backroom deals, all that shady stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's part of the story, but it's way more complicated and fascinating than you might expect.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is to think about the context that these machines grow out of. So imagine American cities just exploding in size with millions of immigrants arriving, a lot of them not speaking English, all trying to figure out life in this brand new world. And city governments back then really weren't equipped to handle this kind of growth and change.
So basically, there was a huge need, and the official channels weren't really stepping up to meet it.
Exactly. And that's where these political machines come in.
Yeah.
They fill a void. They almost become like this shadow government.
Okay, so who are these bosses running these machines?
Often they were immigrants themselves or first-generation Americans, you know. So they understood the struggles of newcomers firsthand, and a lot of them were Irish, which might seem surprising.
Yeah, why was that?
Well, think about it. Fluency in English,
Yeah.
you know, gave them a huge advantage in the political world. Plus, a lot of Irish immigrants had experience with political organizing back in Ireland, fighting for their rights under British rule. So they came to America with a unique skill set, ready-made for this new urban landscape.
So they had the know-how, the drive, and the connections. But how did these machines actually gain and hold on to power?
It all boiled down to votes. They mobilized these huge immigrant communities, and they offered vital services in return for loyalty at the polls.
Hmm.
Imagine needing a coal delivery in the dead of winter, or help navigating a legal problem, or even just protection from the police,
Oh, wow.
which, by the way, the machines often had significant influence over.
So it wasn't just about handing out turkeys at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
It was about providing essential support that people desperately needed.
Right, and keep in mind, this was before, robust social safety nets existed. So the machines stepped in to provide for vulnerable populations when no one else would.
Right.
It was a lifeline for many. But that support came with a price: unwavering loyalty to the machine, and most importantly, votes.
I see. So it was a complex exchange. Help in times of need for guaranteed political support.
Right.
But let's be honest, it also sounds like a breeding ground for corruption.
You're not wrong. And when we talk about corruption in the context of political machines, we're talking about different levels of it. There was this straightforward, kickbacks from contractors who got favorable deals on city projects or maybe selling franchises for things like streetcars and waterworks. But then there was this fascinating concept called honest graft.
Honest graft, that sounds like an oxymoron, almost like saying healthy junk food.
Right.
How can graft be honest?
That's the thing, right? It sounds almost comical, but George Washington Plunkett, a Tammany Hall boss in New York City, was a big proponent of this idea. Basically, it meant using insider knowledge for personal gain in ways that were technically illegal, or at least not explicitly illegal at the time.
So, like knowing where a new road is going to be built, buying up the land cheap before anyone else, and then selling it to the city at a huge profit when they need it for the project.
Exactly.
Basically, insider trading, but with city development.
Exactly. Plunkett would argue that he was just being a savvy businessman taking advantage of opportunities that anyone else could have. But the ethical implications are pretty clear to us now.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows. It sounds like the line between public service and self-enrichment was pretty blurry. But when we talk about political machines and corruption, there's one name that always comes up: Boss Tweed.
Right. William M. Tweed, the boss of Tammany Hall in the 1860s and 70s, he's practically the poster child for political machine corruption. His excesses were legendary, and they eventually land him in jail, really cementing this image of political machines as inherently corrupt.
Yeah, his name has become synonymous with greed and political excess. But here's something I find interesting. The story of political machines isn't just about corruption and scandals, right? These organizations had a significant impact on American cities, and not all of it was bad.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to acknowledge that they weren't just engines of corruption. They also played a vital role in modernizing city infrastructure, expanding government services, and bringing some stability to a time of immense growth and social change.
So while their motives may not have always been pure, they did get things done, and those actions had a real impact on the lives of everyday people.
Precisely. It's a complex legacy, a blend of good and bad, and understanding that complexity is key to understanding this period of American history.
So if these machines were so powerful, corrupt or not, why were they able to thrive for so long? What allowed this kind of system to exist and flourish?
Well, there are a few key factors. First, you have the immigrant voters themselves. Many of them value tangible services over abstract ideas of good government, particularly if they were struggling to survive in a new and often hostile environment.
Right.
They needed help, and they needed it now, and the machines delivered.
It was about practical, immediate needs, not some theoretical ideal. But the machines wouldn't have done it alone, could they? I mean, where did they get the resources to provide all these services?
That's where the city's elites come in.
Yeah.
Wealthy individuals and businesses often benefited from their dealings with the machines, whether through favorable contracts or just having a predictable, if somewhat shady, system in place.
So it was a mutually beneficial relationship, even if it came at the cost of transparency and ethical governance.
Exactly. And then you have to consider the city governments themselves. Many of them were weak and disorganized, ill-equipped to handle the challenges of rapid urbanization. The machines, with their hierarchical structure and efficient, though often corrupt methods, stepped in to fill that power vacuum.
It's almost like they created a shadow government that was actually more effective than the official one in a lot of ways. But surely they weren't completely unstoppable. There must have been pushback against this level of power and corruption.
No, absolutely. Machines weren't invincible. Reform movements popped up all the time, fueled by public anger over the blatant corruption and inequality. And they achieved some significant victories. Tammany Hall, for example, despite its immense power, often lost mayoral races to reform candidates.
So it was a constant back and forth, a struggle between the entrenched power of the machines and those who wanted to clean up the system.
Precisely. It was a dynamic political landscape, with these machines constantly being challenged and sometimes defeated.
Yeah.
But they were also remarkably adaptable, constantly finding new ways to survive and maintain their influence.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of political machines. Last time we explored how these organizations rose to power in American cities during a time of intense growth and change, filling that void left by overwhelmed city governments.
Yeah, we talked about how they cultivated loyalty by providing, those essential services to immigrant communities, often in exchange for their votes. And of course, we touched on the corruption that was rampant within these machines, from straightforward kickbacks to that more nuanced concept of honest graft.
Right. It's almost mind-boggling to think about how these machines operated, wielding so much power and influence. But today, I'd love to get a better understanding of the inner workings of these organizations. What was their day-to-day operation like? What strategies did they use to maintain their grip on power?
Well, one key to their success was their organizational structure. Think of it like a pyramid with the boss at the very top, controlling everything. Below him, you had layers of ward bosses, precinct captains, even block captains, each responsible for a specific geographic area.
So it was a very hierarchical system with clear lines of authority and responsibility.
Exactly, and those lower-level operatives, those precinct and block captains, they were the ones who really made the machine work. They were embedded in their communities, interacting with people on a daily basis. They knew who needed a job, who needed help with a legal issue, who might be struggling to pay their rent.
So they were like community liaisons, building relationships and gathering information, but with a political motive, of course.
They were masters of cultivating loyalty, building a network of obligation that extended far beyond just handing out favors.
Yeah.
It was about creating a sense of dependence on the machine, ensuring that when election day rolled around, those votes would come through.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly organized structure, these local operatives embedded in the community, all working to keep the boss in power. But what were some of the specific tactics they used? How did they actually get people to vote for their candidates?
Patronage was huge. City jobs were incredibly sought after, especially in departments like police, fire, sanitation jobs that offered security and stability. And guess who controlled those appointments?
The machine, of course. So
Yeah.
if you wanted a city job, you knew who to go to. It wasn't about qualifications, it was about who you knew.
You got it. And it wasn't just jobs. It was licenses, permits, government contracts, all those things that could make or break a small business or just make life a little easier for someone trying to get ahead.
So they were basically controlling people's livelihoods, holding the keys to economic opportunity.
In many ways, yes, it was a system built on rewards and, let's be honest, punishments. If you played ball with the machine, you could expect favors and opportunities. But if you crossed them well, things could get pretty difficult.
It sounds almost like a mafia movie with the boss pulling strings and calling in favors, but also having the power to make life very difficult for anyone who stepped out of line.
That's not a bad analogy. And speaking of mafia tactics, let's not forget about voter intimidation and fraud. Those were unfortunately part of the playbook as well.
Right. That's the darker side of the machine that we can't ignore. Tell me more about that.
Well, in some cases, they would actually pay people to vote for their candidates. Or they might offer food alcohol, other incentives in exchange for a vote. And if those tactics didn't work, they weren't above resorting to threats or even violence to make sure the right candidate won.
Wow, it's a stark reminder that this was a time when political power could be wielded in some really ruthless ways. It wasn't all parades and picnics.
Definitely not. And that's why the reform movements we talked about earlier were so crucial. People recognized that this kind of unchecked power was a threat to democracy. They corrupted the entire system.
Okay, so we've talked about the patronage system, the darker tactics like voter intimidation and fraud. But weren't there also more benevolent ways that machines maintained their power?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that these organizations weren't just about corruption and manipulation. They also understood the importance of providing real tangible benefits to their constituents.
Right, that services for votes system. Tell me more about the kinds of services they provided.
It could range from basic necessities like food and coal for the poor to things like legal aid for immigrants who were struggling to navigate a complex legal system, or they might set up job training programs to help people acquire new skills and find employment.
So, in a way, they were almost like a proto-welfare state filling in the gaps where government services were lacking.
That's a good way to put it. And it's important to remember that many of these bosses had come from poverty themselves. They understood the struggles of their constituents firsthand.
So it was a mix of genuine compassion and shrewd political strategy.
Exactly. They weren't just buying votes, they were building relationships, creating a sense of obligation and loyalty that went far beyond just casting a ballot.
It's fascinating, this idea of machines operating on multiple levels, the corruption, the intimidation, but also the genuine desire to help people to build a better community. Do you have any stories that really illustrate how these machines operated in practice, something that brings it all to life?
Oh, absolutely. There are countless stories. But one that always comes to mind involves George Washington. Plunkett, the Tammany Hall boss we mentioned earlier, the one who championed honest graft.
Right, him. What did he do?
Well, Plunkett had this uncanny ability to know what people needed and figure out how to provide it, even if it meant bending the rules a little. There's a famous anecdote about a fire that broke out in his district.
Okay, so he's rushing to the scene to offer support to those affected by the fire. Sounds like a good politician move.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't just offer sympathy. He started handing out money to the families who had lost their homes.
But cash on the spot. That's pretty impressive, I have to admit.
Right. And not just a few dollars either. He was reportedly handing out $50 bills, which was a lot of money back then.
Wow, he was really going all out. It sounds like genuine concern for his constituents, but I'm guessing there was more to it than just pure generosity.
Right. Of course, Plunkett understood that those families would be incredibly grateful for his help, and that gratitude would translate into votes for him and his candidates in the next election. It was a brilliant, if somewhat cynical move. He was solving a real problem, showing his commitment to his community, and solidifying his power base all at the same time.
It was a public display of power and compassion, all rolled into one. A savvy political move, for sure.
Exactly. And it worked. Plunkett remained a powerful figure in Tammany Hall for decades because he understood what his constituents needed and found creative ways to provide it, even if those methods weren't always ethically sound.
It's a great example of how complex and multi-layered these organizations were. They weren't just about greed and corruption. They were also about community, about helping people, about building something bigger than themselves. It's a side of the story that often gets overlooked.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray, competing motivations, unintended consequences, and those complexities are what make it so fascinating to study.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, exploring the intricate workings of these political machines, the tactics they use to gain and maintain power, and the impact they had on the lives of everyday people. But there's still more to uncover.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the eventual decline of these powerful machines and the factors that led to their downfall. We'll also examine their lasting legacy on American cities, both the positive and the negative.
So stay tuned for the final chapter in the story of political machines, where we'll see how a system that seems so dominant eventually began to crumble, paving the way for a new era in American urban politics. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of political machines. We've explored their rise to power, their intricate inner workings, and the blend of services, favors, and sometimes ethically questionable tactics they use to maintain their influence.
We've also seen how these organizations were more than just engines of corruption. They played a significant role in shaping American cities, often driving modernization and providing vital services to a rapidly growing urban population.
Right, it's that complexity that makes this era so fascinating. But now I'm curious about their downfall. What led to the decline of these seemingly all-powerful machines? Was it a sudden collapse or more of a gradual process?
It was more of a gradual erosion of their power, influenced by several key factors. One important shift was the rise of a more educated and politically aware middle class as cities prospered. People became less reliant on the machines for basic necessities and more attuned to the corruption that was often woven into the system.
So, as their economic circumstances improved, people began to demand a more transparent and accountable form of government. They were less willing to turn a blind eye to the machine's questionable practices.
Exactly, and this growing dissatisfaction fueled a wave of reform movements across the country. These movements were often spearheaded by journalists, the muckrakers as they were called, who exposed the excesses of the machines and rallied public support for change.
The muckrakers played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. They weren't afraid to shine a light on the dark underbelly of society, even when it meant facing powerful and dangerous adversaries.
Absolutely. Their investigations, often published in widely circulated newspapers and magazines, brought the issue of political machine corruption into the homes of everyday Americans. They helped create a climate where reform wasn't just desirable, it was politically feasible.
It's a reminder of the power of a free press to hold those in power accountable. Were there any other factors that contributed to the machine's decline?
Another significant factor was the gradual expansion of government services and the creation of social safety nets as city governments became more professionalized and responsive to the needs of their citizens. The machine's role as the primary provider of essential services began to shrink.
So the very void that they had filled, that need for basic support and services, was slowly being addressed by legitimate government institutions.
Precisely. And as those institutions gained legitimacy and effectiveness, the machine's hold on power weakened. People no longer had to rely on a system that demanded loyalty and votes in exchange for basic necessities.
It's fascinating how the evolution of government itself played a role in undermining these extra legal power structures. Were there any specific reforms that targeted the machines directly? I mean, laws or policies designed to curb their influence?
Yes, there were a number of reforms aimed specifically at limiting the machine's power. One of the most impactful was the introduction of civil service exams for city jobs.
So instead of getting a job based on your connections to the machine, you actually had to demonstrate your qualifications.
Exactly. Civil service exams helped to level the playing field, ensuring that city jobs went to those who are most qualified, not just those who are most connected.
It's remarkable how a seemingly simple change like that could have such a profound impact on the dynamics of power. Were there any other legislative reforms that targeted the machines?
Another key reform was the adoption of the secret ballot. Before that, voting was often done publicly, making it easy for the machines to intimidate voters and ensure they voted the right way. The secret ballot gave voters a degree of anonymity and protection they had never had before.
Right, it made it much harder for the machines to manipulate elections and control the outcome.
Precisely these reforms, along with a growing public awareness of the machine's corrupt practices, chipped away at their power over time.
So did the machines just vanish overnight once these reforms were put in place?
Not exactly. They were remarkably resilient, adapting to the changing political landscape and finding new ways to exert influence. But their days of absolute dominance were over.
So they evolved, perhaps becoming less overt in their operations, but still clinging to some degree of power.
You could say that in some cities, remnants of these machines persisted well into the 20th century, often functioning more like traditional political organizations, relying on fundraising and campaigning rather than the blatant patronage and manipulation that had characterized their earlier years.
A more subtle, but perhaps more insidious form of influence. It makes you wonder if those tendencies are still present in politics today, just in different forms.
It's a question worth pondering, but one thing's for sure. The era of the all-powerful, city-controlling political machine had come to an end.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the rise and fall of these complex and controversial organizations, delving into their inner workings, the factors that contributed to their success and ultimate decline, and their lasting impact on American cities.
It's been a fascinating journey through a period of American history that is often overlooked, but one that offers valuable insights into the nature of power, the complexities of urban development, and the constant struggle for a more just and equitable society.
It's a story that reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's full of contradictions, competing motivations, and unintended consequences, and understanding those nuances is essential to understanding the forces that have shaped our world.
It also underscores the importance of civic engagement, of holding those in power accountable, and of demanding a system of governance that serves the needs of all citizens, not just a select few.
Well said. We've learned a lot about political machines, but perhaps even more importantly, we've been reminded that the fight for good governance, for transparency and accountability is an ongoing process. It requires vigilance, participation, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.